All right, welcome to our last video. And this video should really help you get a jump start on the rough draft due next class. So in this video, we are going to practice forming connections between two texts by pairing a quotation from Zuboff with a quotation from Hartman. And that pairing will be the basis of a body paragraph, right? So in unpacking and explaining that connection between those two texts, those two quotations, you can build a body paragraph out around that connection. Okay, and so there is a resource here I want to pull up for you, which can be helpful throughout the semester with forging connections between the text, especially if you are a visual kind of person and you kind of like to see ideas as you're kind of mapping them out. So under week 4, resources and handouts, we have a couple of connection maps. And so the first one is blank. And so I encourage you to play around with this as you're brainstorming for the rough draft due next class. And we'll take a look at that here. So I pull it up. So this is our connection map then. And again, the basis of a body paragraph would be pairing two quotations. So from our text here, Zuboff and Hartman. And what this allows us to do then is, particularly we're going to be focusing on this box, the linking words and phrases. So really, what makes for an efficient pairing that's really successful between the texts is choosing just the right quotations, right? So quotations where words and phrases and key terms are going to resonate with words, phrases, and key terms from the quotation from the other text. And so this kind of mapping can help you kind of plot that out. So I could find a quotation from Zuboff, right, that links to key term, and think about, a passage from Hartman where I see that key term or important word from Zuboff being demonstrated, right, where I see it at work in Hartman. And then here, this box will help me think through what those connections are. Because again, as we were practicing with the Zuboff quotations from the group work, you really want to kind of, after you set up a quotation in a body paragraph, you want to pause, you want to pull out language, you want to work with it, interpret it. And that's what you're going to be doing as you're forging connections between texts, right? You'll be working with two quotations at bare minimum, and you'll be pulling out language from both and connecting that language together. And so that kind of connection making you're going to be doing in this box here. And then the rest of the map, it's space really to help you kind of brainstorm, to develop and unpack the connection you're making. And then you can kind of type some ideas and developing the connection. And then as you're drafting your paragraph, then you have all the raw material, turn it out here in this connection map. Okay. And if we come back to our week 4 module, again, under resources and handouts, beneath the blank map, we have a map that's focused on the right to the future tense. So forging a connection between Zuboff and Hartman through the right to the future tense, right? That particular key term. And overall, it's a really effective strategy in making connections between texts, right? To forge that connection through a key term or important idea or concept from one text. Okay, so we'll go ahead and pull up this next connection map. So connection map 1, demonstrating the right to the future tense. Okay, so as you can see, this connection map, I've started to fill it in. So just for the purposes of practice, I pulled out some quotations that help us to define the right to the future tense. And then I've chosen a quotation from Hartman where I feel Esther Brown is demonstrating or exercising her right to the future tense. And so I'm imagining that I would be pairing these quotations, I would be building a body paragraph out around them. And so what I want to do first is focus on this linking words and phrases box. So go ahead, and I encourage you to download this particular connection map from our week 4 module to play around in or with, or both, and to think through, how the language from each quotation resonates with language from the other quotation. So kind of going through, let's say, Zuboff first. And I've identified this first quotation as a primary quotation because, as we talked in a previous video, to define the right to the future tense, you first want a quotation that has that key term in it. And then you can pull in these secondary or supplemental quotations to help kind of further develop that key term. And so I have a few here, right? And again, for body paragraphs, you need one quotation from each text minimum. So you can certainly bring in more than one quotation from one text. And so I want to think about, which words and phrases from these quotations seem to resonate with which words and phrases from the Hartman quotation. And so as you can see with the arrows, it's bigger here, you're going to pull out language and you can bold it or underline it. And then you're going to record that language here in the box and record language here. And then jot down little notes. And you can also do that here and develop the connection if you run out of room. That kind of explains how a particular word, let's say from Hartman, is related to a particular word or key term from the Zuboff quotation. So again, our goal is to explain how we see Esther Brown demonstrating or exercising the right to the future tense in this passage. And in order to do that, we first have to define what that right to the future tense is using quotations from Zuboff. So go ahead and take a few minutes and again, go ahead and download this from week 4. Mark up this language, bold, underline, highlight, whatever you would like to do. Same with Hartman. And, link words and phrases from both of these quotations, kind of talk it through a little bit. And again, you can use the space and develop the connection if you would like as well. Okay, and when the ball pops up, then in our play pause it video here, you're going to type in whatever words, whatever notes you wrote into the linking words and phrases box, as well as develop the connection. Okay, so let's start here with our quotations from Zuboff. So here you may have bolded, let's say, future, which is important, right? And I'm interested in risks, right, which kind of ties into the notion of uncertainty in the future through Arendt. And this notion of freedom. And of course, the right to the future tense. And here, this quotation from our writing sample passage we talked a lot about, right? So all this really kind of human, organic kind of imagery, our key term will, future, and also this notion of patient discovery, I think is going to be important when we start making a connection over here to Hartman. And again, our right to speak in the first person as the author of our future. So all of this language could be important. Okay, and then also freedom. There's no freedom without uncertainty. So quotation that is linking definitively uncertainty with freedom. And again, we have the will and we have the notion of promise. Great. And so kind of all that bolded or underlined language we want to keep in mind as we're thinking through the Hartman quotation. And so here, as she drifted through the streets, 1,000 ideas about who she might be and what she might do rushed into her head, but she was uncertain what to make of them. Her thoughts were inchoate, fragmentary, wild. How they might become a blueprint for something better was unclear. All right, and so here we have uncertain. Perhaps that was the first word that popped out of the Hartman quotation, right? So it's pretty rare that we have a direct connection like this, where a key term from one text is also used in the other text, right? So here we have uncertain, and we start kind of color coding connections here. So here we noticed that she's uncertain. And so that connection could be a way of talking through that basically Esther Brown is exercising freedom there, right? So uncertainty is a marker of freedom. She's expressing her will, right? In that sense of uncertainty. And also this notion of blueprint is interesting, right? Good. And when we think of the right to the future tense, right, and the future, what language sticks out for us from the Hartman quotation? Right? So which words and phrases from the Hartman quotation, and you may have already pulled this out, but if not, it bears emphasis here. So what language is being used to express the future in the Hartman quotation? Okay, so again, language to express the future or the future tense here in Hartman. So the future tense, right? So 1,000 ideas about who she might be, right? So in other words, who she might be in the future. She's imagining who she might be in the future, and she's imagining her future, right? Which is demonstrating the right to the future tense. So who she might be, what she might do, right? So future behavior, perhaps contemplating some original action. Oh, this is not, sorry, my Zoom thing is all up in my business, making it hard for me to highlight here. No, that's not what I want to do. All right, here we go. What she might do. Now we've got it. Right, so again, that future tense, imagining who she might be, shaping her future, and her future is uncertain, right? Good, and good, this idea of authoring kind of her future, right? She's the one kind of writing or thinking through, right? She has these ideas coming into her head about how she might write her future. And another interesting connection, I think, as well, right? If we think about this risk here, give that a color, yellow. So here, so in exercising our right to the future tense and our freedom, we necessarily then take risks because again, we don't know what the future holds. It's uncertain, it's unpredictable. And so take a moment, and in this quotation from Hartman, where do we see Esther Brown taking a risk? So again, knowing what we know from the Hartman chapter about the kind of the dangers that young women like Esther Brown faced in the early 20th century in Harlem, what risk is she taking in this quotation? What words and phrases from this quotation demonstrate that risk taking? All right, so risk taking. So one way to go about that, right, So the very fact that she's drifting through the streets, right? And again, this is a time when um, young Black women in particular, right, were being surveilled and monitored, right, by the police, um, and in other ways by social workers, judges, the court system, right, um, and by whites themselves, right, looking to kind of police the racial order of the time. And so by simply drifting through the streets, kind of exercising that freedom of movement would be risky, right? So again, as Zuboff demonstrates, women could be, kind of taken up by the police, right, under charges of perhaps vagrancy or prostitution, right? Um, and so again, simply moving around the city with that kind of freedom would be risky. It would be uncertain, right? It would be expressing freedom and therefore the right to the future tense. Okay, and another word that I think is really interesting from Hartman, right? I'm reading this, that stands out to me. So I want to think that through. So this notion of a blueprint. So how her thoughts, right, which are inchoate, they're fragmentary, they're wild, right? We could classify this too in relation to uncertainty, right? If they're fragmentary, if they're wild, especially if they're wild, they're uncertain. How they might become, and we get some more future tense being used here. Color code that. How they might become a blueprint. So how these thoughts might become a blueprint for something better and something better in the future, right? Was unclear relating to uncertain. So do that with blue. Okay, so for blueprint then, what key term or key terms from the Zuboff quotations might help us interpret blueprint from Hartman? So in other words, what words or key terms from these quotations from Zuboff seem to resonate or help us interpret or explain how blueprint is functioning in the Hartman quotation? Yeah, so I think you could go a couple ways here, right? So with blueprint, could be this idea of the promise. So here she is drifting through the street, imagining who she might be, what she might do in the future, thinking about how she'll shape her own future, right? Her blueprint, her plan for the future. And so that plan for the future, right, could be a promise, right? A promise to herself about who she might become, what she might do, her plans for the future. And so we could link this notion of blueprint to the Arendtian notion of the promise, right? And how that promise mitigates the uncertainty or the fear we have of uncertainty when we think of the future. And how we negotiate that, right, by making promises to ourselves. Okay, let's see. Okay, and then a last connection here we could play around with. I'm interested in this notion of patient discovery from Zuboff. Let's assign that a color. So again, our wills create the future and the patient discovery of each new sentence or step. So again, we need to be able to exercise our will freely in order to create a future. And that requires discovery, right? Because if we're discovering something, we didn't know with certainty what it was going to be, right? So we're discovering our futures. And so we can think about this quotation of Hartman. So demonstrating Esther Brown in the process of patiently discovering and creating her future, right? And so when we look here, So she's drifting through the streets. So just this language, right? She's drifting. So there we have patient, right? She's being patient, drifting it slow, right? Meandering. She has 1,000 ideas. I mean, that's a lot of ideas, right? 1,000 ideas about who she might be and what she might do. Again, uncertain of what to make of them. And so here she's in the process of discovery. So she hasn't figured out entirely, what she might do or what she might be. Those thoughts are uncertain. They're inchoate, they're not fully formed, they're fragmentary, they're wild. So here we see the process of discovery rather than the product of discovery, right? So maintaining that uncertainty and that freedom. So how they might become a blueprint, something more certain based on the promise to herself for something better was unclear. So again, all this thinking and all this drifting, this quotation itself, again, could be, we could interpret it through the lens and the language Zuboff provides here with these quotations as Esther Brown in the process of patiently discovering and creating her future. Okay. Okay, and here, just to give you an idea of how you might fill this in. So here, based on our kind of color matching, right, I've kind of started linking language from both of the quotations. So again, the might be, might do, might become from Hartman, resonating, demonstrating the future tense from Zuboff, right? Wills create the future. Then linking uncertainty between both of them, and then interpreting blueprint, and even author, right? You could interpret this passage as Esther Brown authoring herself, authoring her future. And this kind of breaks down and explains that connection. And then again, here linking 1,000 ideas with discovery and uncertainty. And so connecting concept, right? So basically in order to form connections between quotations from both texts, you want to base it on a concept, right? A key term, for example. And so here that connecting concept is the right to the future tense. So we were looking for a quotation, a passage from Hartman that demonstrates, for example, Esther Brown exerting the right to the future tense. And then we would pair that up with quotations from Zuboff that help to define the right to the future tense. Because again, if you're going to make a claim that this passage demonstrates Esther Brown exerting her right to the future tense, you have to use Zuboff's language that she uses to define the right to the future tense and show it at work in the Hartman quotation, right? So everything we did in terms of kind of pairing language between those two quotations. Okay, and coming down here, right, explain, developing the connection. So after I kind of set up these quotations in my body paragraph and start kind of talking through, which words and phrases resonate with which words and phrases from the other quotation, then I can set something up like the passage from Hartman or the quotation from Hartman demonstrates Esther Brown exercising her right to the future tense. In other words, she is in the process of, quote unquote, patiently discovering her future, right? Bringing in language from Zuboff to explain what's going on in the Hartman. And so that's kind of a template that you could use to help kind of integrate the language from both quotations, right? So feel free to use that, to adapt that. And I'll give you access to this then on Monday. We'll kind of talk it through. Okay, and here in this connection map, which we'll also make available in our week 4 module, here I've taken a quotation from Hartman that I felt demonstrated a threat to the right of the future tense. So thinking back again to the language of our prompt, so how was the right to the future tense of young women like Esther Brown, right? How was that right to the future tense under threat? And here, I want to think about well, if I develop this threat paragraph, right, a body paragraph, and I want to use this quotation from Hartman, then I want to think about, okay, well, which quotation or quotations from Zuboff could help me explain how Esther Brown's, right to the future tense was being threatened in this quotation, right? So in the guise of housing reform, the police were given great latitude in the surveillance and arrest of Black women in tenement residents. The bulk of the arrests were justified less for what had been done than on the suspicion of who these young women might become. Okay, and so we would move through the same process, right? Kind of pulling out or underlining or bolding language that seems to resonate from the Hartman quotation with ideas from Zuboff. And then we would want to pair it with quotations from Zuboff. So for example, we talked about some of the risks in the Zuboff quotations in which she defines the right to the future tense, right? So we could play around with some of that language. Also in the quotations from the Zuboff group work, think about how those quotations set up a threat to the right to the future tense. So some of that language from the top of my head from those quotations, right? It talks about how surveillance capitalism automates you, right? So in other words, could some of the surveillance that police are enacting here in this passage from Hartman, is it functioning to attempt to automate these women, to modify their behavior, right, to author them, etc. And so I encourage you to kind of play around with this map as you're brainstorming, getting that rough draft ready for next class. Okay, so I look forward to your rough drafts. And again, remember, emphasis on the rough. So mainly you just want to practice pairing quotations, building a body paragraph out around them that explains the connections and that links those connections back to your response to the questions of the prompt, right? And we'll talk more about resistance and language that Zuboff uses to describe resistance. So definitely some of you found those key terms from later in the chapter. So particularly withdrawal of agreement. And so those two forms of withdrawal, right? So a counter declaration and synthetic declaration. And so we'll play around with those next class. Okay, I look forward to your rough drafts. Have a good weekend.